They say every family has secrets, but some are too dark, too tangled in blood and shame to ever be spoken aloud. Somewhere in the folds of American history lies a story so disturbing that even the people who lived it refuse to speak its name. A woman born into silence. A bride made from the same bloodline that created her. Her name was never meant to be remembered, and yet her existence lingers like a ghost on the edge of every generation that followed. It begins in the Appalachian Hills, a place both breathtaking and brutal, where isolation was not just a way of life, but a kind of prison. In the 1800s, whole families were trapped by geography, by poverty, and by tradition. Outsiders rarely came, and those who didn't stay long. And so, generation after generation, the same names appeared on birth records. Fathers, cousins, lovers, until bloodlines blurred and identity itself became a secret best left unspoken. In that forgotten valley, a girl was born into a family already consumed by its own reflection. Her mother was her cousin. Her father, a man whose name carried whispers no one dared repeat. They said the baby came out pale, too quiet, with eyes that never seemed to focus, like she already knew the world she'd entered wasn't safe. By the time she was 15, she'd become both the pride and the curse of her kin, the one who would carry on the name, whether she wanted to or not. They called her the bride before she could even spell her own name. There was no wedding in the way you'd imagine, no church bells, no vows under heaven. Just a gathering in a candle-lit room where faces blurred together in the smoke and hands exchanged her like property. When morning came, she was no longer a daughter. She was something else, something the town would never speak of, but always remember. Even now, if you walk those hills at night, some say you can hear her humming, a low, mournful sound that drifts through the trees, a reminder that not all family stories end with love, some begin with blood. They tried to keep her hidden. For years, she existed like a shadow, drifting between the wooden walls of her family's worn-out home, never seen in daylight, never allowed to speak to strangers. The townsfolk whispered that the family was cursed, that something inside that house wasn't right. No one dared to go near after dusk. They said if you stood outside and listened long enough, you could hear crying, but not the kind that came from grief, the kind that came from confusion, from something that didn't understand why it was alive. Her husband, her own blood, was a man twisted by the same lineage that had given him life. His features were wrong, softened in places they shouldn't be, eyes set too far apart, a mouth that rarely formed words anyone could understand. He'd been born to a woman who was both his mother and his aunt, and though his mind never grew past that of a child, he'd been told all his life that it was his duty to marry her, to keep the bloodline pure. That word, pure, echoed through generations like a curse disguised as pride. The girl, now bound to him, carried that burden in silence. She tended to him, fed him, and obeyed her elders. But in the stillness of the night, she wrote in secret. Scrawled notes hidden in floorboards and behind the hearth. Words trembling with fear and guilt. They said God made us this way. But if that's true, why does he hide his face from me? No one ever found those letters until decades later, when the house was long abandoned, its roof caved in, its wood soaked in rot. By then, her story had become a local legend, the inbred bride of Appalachia. They called her, though few believed she was ever real. But the records say otherwise. In a faded census from 1871, there's a name, first and last the same, and next to it, the mark of a cross where her husband's signature should have been. He couldn't write. He could barely speak, but his family saw him as the vessel through which their legacy would continue, and it did. For another generation, the pattern repeated, quietly, without question, until the bloodline became so tangled that no one could tell who was brother, who was cousin, who was father. Only that something was deeply, irreversibly wrong. When the baby came, the midwife refused to speak of it. They said she left the house pale as death, clutching her rosary so tight the beads left marks on her skin. The infant survived, but barely. He was born with a twisted spine, one eye clouded white, and a faint tremor that never stopped. The family said it was God's punishment for gossip, warning the neighbors to keep quiet. But those who saw the child said he looked like something the earth itself had tried to reject, a living echo of sins too long buried. The bride, still barely a woman, held that child and wept, not because of what he was, but because she saw herself in him. the product of decisions made long before she ever drew breath. Her husband called the baby a gift. Her mother called him redemption. But when she looked into that child's single clear eye, she didn't see purity or salvation. She saw an ending, the slow unraveling of everything her family had built on lies. There were moments when she thought of escape. At night, when the wind pressed against the walls, she would imagine walking away, leaving the valley, the house, the bloodline. But then she'd hear the soft footsteps in the hall, the murmurs of her elders, reciting their family scripture. We are of one blood. We remain one blood. It wasn't faith that bound them. It was fear, the terror of outsiders discovering what they'd become. As the years passed, the child grew, but the deformities deepened. His limbs stiffened, his words never came. He would sit for hours on the porch, rocking slowly, humming that same melody his mother once whispered in her sleep. It became the sound of the house itself, a lullaby of sorrow echoing through generations. By the time she was 25, the bride's face had aged decades. Her hair had lost its color, and yet she kept living, as if waiting for some kind of release that never came. Death in that place was not feared. It was longed for, because death was the only thing that could break the chain, the only way to end what had been set in motion before she was born. By the turn of the century, the valley had fallen silent. The railroad had come and gone, taking with it the last of the travelers who might have seen the family for what they were. The house stood on a hill, its windows black with soot, its fields gone to weeds. People in the nearest town called it the Whisper House. They said at night you could hear voices, not screaming, not crying, just voices murmuring in circles, as if trapped between prayer and madness. Inside, the bride lived on, alone now. Her husband had died years earlier. Some said of sickness, others said his body simply gave out under the weight of its own blood. When they buried him, the preacher refused to come. The family dug their own grave and lowered him into the ground without a word. After that, she stopped leaving the house altogether. The letters she once hid became her only company, each one written to no one, as if she hoped someday someone, anyone, might find them and understand. One note, found years later, reedy. The blood speaks, even when the mouth cannot. It tells stories we were never meant to repeat. She was right, because the blood did speak. Her son, now grown, began to show the same afflictions as his father. The same silence, the same slow deterioration of the mind. When visitors came, census takers, traveling ministers, she hid him beneath the floorboards, whispering that it was for his safety. But perhaps it was shame. Perhaps she knew that if they saw him, they would see the truth written in his body. By then, the family's name had vanished from public record. They stopped attending church, stopped paying taxes. The town forgot them, or pretended to, until the day a flood came through the valley and tore the roof from that old house. What was left inside would haunt anyone who dared to look. Walls lined with strange markings, mirrors turned to face the wall, and in one corner, a small crib carved with initials that matched no birth record in the county. They say the bride was found sitting beside it, long gone, her face untouched by decay, as if even death didn't want to disturb her rest. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed or run? After the flood, the property was abandoned, left to rot, swallowed by ivy and time. But stories have a way of refusing to die, especially the ones that were never supposed to be told. Local children dared each other to climb the hill at dusk, to peek through the broken windows where the Whisper House once breathed. Some came back pale, swearing they'd seen a woman's shape in the doorway, her head tilted, her lips moving as if still whispering the words she'd written 100 years before. Decades later, in 1943, a historian from Kentucky came across an old newspaper clipping. Just a few sentences about an isolated mountain family who died out due to sickness of the blood. The historian went looking for the house, but what he found was something far worse. Beneath the floorboards, sealed in tin boxes, were the bride's final writings, the same letters once hidden in fear. They spoke of confusion, guilt, and love so twisted it became indistinguishable from pain. In one of her last notes, her handwriting barely legible, she wrote, "I dream sometimes that I am someone else, a girl with clean hands, who doesn't hear the dead calling her name. But when I wake, the air smells like them, like the past, like blood. Those words were never meant for the public, but they were published anyway in a local folklore collection. Readers dismissed them as fiction, too grotesque to be real. Yet the names, the dates, and the census records matched too precisely to ignore. The story of the inbred bride wasn't a fable. It was a record, a documentation of generational rot, preserved in ink and sorrow. As the 20th century advanced, the bloodline thinned, scattered into new towns and new names. Yet medical records from nearby counties still show traces. Children born with inexplicable mutations, families with the same haunting genetic markers. The blood didn't disappear. It just changed its face. They say that somewhere in the Appalachian region, a few descendants remain, unaware of who they come from, living ordinary lives, never knowing their great-great-grandmother's story still stains their DNA. And sometimes, when the night is too quiet, they hear humming, that same melody, the one that began with her. Some years ago, a team of genealogists decided to trace the old Appalachian families, to see how many shared the same ancestral threads. It was meant to be academic, a simple historical project, but what they uncovered turned into something closer to an exorcism. Names that had vanished reappeared, linked by bloodlines too close for comfort. One branch led directly to that forgotten valley, and to her, they found her name again, written in the brittle ink of a church ledger. Born 1856, died 1902, cause of death, wasting illness. But the local doctor's notes, long hidden in an attic trunk, tell a different story. Patient showed signs of delusion, speaks of voices in the blood, refuses food, refuses prayer. It wasn't illness that killed her. It was awareness, the dawning horror of understanding what she was a part of. In the generations that followed, the family's descendants tried to erase her. They burned the letters. They denied the stories. Yet some things don't burn. They live in whispers, in old photographs, in the faint resemblance between faces that should never look so alike. When modern DNA tests began circulating, two families in separate states discovered a genetic anomaly. A signature so rare, it traced back to a single ancestral cluster from that very region. The scientists called it an isolated hereditary loop, but in truth it was a curse. The same one she tried to end. One of those descendants, a woman living in West Virginia, once said that as a child, she'd wake to the sound of someone humming outside her room. The tune was soft, repetitive, almost soothing. When she told her grandmother, the old woman went pale. "Don't answer," she whispered. "That song ain't for you." The bride's story had been buried under a century of denial. But blood doesn't forget. It remembers everything. Every name, every sin, every secret. The family may have scattered, but their silence still hangs in those mountains like mist. The land itself seems haunted by them, by what they did to preserve a name that should have been allowed to die. And when the wind passes through the valley, it still carries her last words, scrawled in shaking hands. "If I am to be remembered, let it not be for who I loved, but for what love cost me." Time has a cruel way of polishing tragedy until it almost looks like myth. But the truth behind America's Most Inbred Bride was never folklore. It was a wound that never healed. Even now, her story sits at the crossroads of faith, shame, and the unspoken horrors of blood loyalty. Families across the country carry traces of her legacy without ever knowing it. That's the cruelest part. The way history hides its sins inside us, making us believe we are untouched. The deeper researchers dig into these forgotten genealogies, the more unsettling the pattern becomes. Whole counties where last names loop endlessly, where church registries repeat the same handful of families for over a century. Poverty played its role, isolation did the rest. But beneath it all was something darker, a belief that the family name was sacred, that outsiders were danger, that purity was the same thing as survival. That idea didn't die with her, it just changed shape. When you look closely enough, you start to realize her story isn't just about one family. It's about what happens when pride becomes obsession, when tradition becomes a cage. Every generation that followed her carried a piece of the same quiet sickness, the refusal to see truth for what it is. And maybe that's why her spirit lingers. Not to haunt the living, but to remind them what silence creates. Because she did try to stop it. Her letters were confessions, warnings, pleas to a world that refused to listen. But no one did. And by the time the world caught up, her bloodline had already dissolved into history. The records, the graves, even the house, all gone. All except the melody. That slow, mournful hum that seems to surface wherever her descendants are found. Some say it's superstition. Others say it's memory, something in the blood that remembers even when the mind forgets. Either way, her story remains, passed down like a secret prayer in the dark, a reminder that the past is never buried, only waiting to be uncovered. So if you ever find yourself deep in the hills of Appalachia and you hear humming on the wind, don't follow it. That song belongs to her, the bride who was never meant to be. And now you know her secret, the one America tried to forget.